All right, we are live. And as promised, I am doing the periodic Your Questions Answered. And this week's question is a perler, again from our serial inquisitor, Connor Reed. Thanks very much for your question. And again, please send through your questions, everyone, if there's certain things that you want to know. And Connor's question today is, is it better doing sets with rep ranges or just going effort and push it to failure? Well, I love this question. I love the attitude. I love the language. Everything about it is awesome. But um, I guess the answer, though, is not going to be as straightforward, right? Because it always depends on a number of factors. And here are sort of five of, initial reasons. There's probably a whole heap, but I'll just focus on five for today. So the first one is, depends on what your goals are, right? So, for example, if you're doing a strength phase, then on certain exercises, you probably are going to go and try and push it till failure. But if you're doing, if you're trying to build certain muscles or you're doing smaller muscle groups, you're not going to try and go for failure for every single set, and certainly not for every single exercise. The other thing is around how often you're training. So again, depending on what type of training program you're doing, whether you're focusing on hypertrophy or slash muscle growth, whether you're shredding for a competition, for example, and you're a bit dry, you're certainly not going to be pushing for absolute going till failure. Well, in theory. And it really depends on what you mean by failure as well. So are we going to failure in terms of lifting as heavy as we can go, or are we going failure just in terms of, repping out? And it depends on what your energy levels are and your propensity to handle training, because, you could be there at the gym for a very long time if you're very, very fit. It also involves, that's kind of going to number three, which is the type of volume and intensity you're typically doing. I've talked a little bit about the training style. And I think this also comes down to where you are in terms of like your training experience, the phase. I've talked about, whether you're, say, for example, competing, and your energy and recovery levels. So, for example, if you're like a powerlifter and you've got a comp coming up, then you're probably going to you want to be pushing through for strength. So, you may have phases where you might be going to failure on certain exercises, but they're not going to be every exercise, and they're probably not going to be every exercise for each set. But then you might have a period of training where you actually don't go to failure and you just build up the ability to handle more load and intensity over time, so that when you get to comp day, you've got plenty in the tank and you can actually push through some of those plateaus. So it really depends on how best you respond to training. And if we take the example of sprinters, for example, they will do the type of training where they'll break down particular parts of the exercise, and say, for example, they got a 100-meter race. Well, they might actually do sets where they do 10 meters, but they run at like 120% of the speed that they would typically run for 100 meters, right? Because the energy is a lot burster, but what they're trying to do, as well as they're trying to improve their power and stamina over shorter distances so that they have better performance over the 100 meters. So then they'll do a lot of also sets as well where they're running much longer distances, 100 meters, for example, and, taking it back and actually just, not putting out as much intensity or as much speed. So the same happens with our training, right? So it really depends on what you're doing, where you're going, and also it can also depend on the day as well. You might find quite typically as well, if you're quite advanced in the training, you might set out with a plan one day to go, quite light, or to have, your sets and your reps, but you're feeling really good on, say, heavy compound movement. Well, what you might do then is you might actually just deprioritize some of the ancillary work and actually keep going and pushing for that. If you're training for a 1 rep maximum, then you're probably going to try and go to failure as you build up to that. Not necessarily in that set, but over a period of time. So I think it really depends. I think having an either or approach is definitely not going to work in this instance. And there are going to be some, and the way that I typically do it as well. So say if you've got like 4 sets and you have anywhere between 6 to 15 reps in those sets, but if you find that you're getting towards the end of the workout and you just really, and you've got lots of energy and you really want to push it, Well, those last sets can typically go to failure with the amount of reps. So you might have an aim of doing, 10, but if you've still got more in the tank, you might do a drop set, and then you might just keep going to failure. So again, it really depends on your energy, intensity. The trick is as well is you don't actually have to go to failure every time that you train to actually make gains. You can still usually build muscle. You can still usually get strength gains without always having to completely exhaust everything that's in the tank. But getting closer to comp, depending on what type of comp you're doing, then you're probably going to push as much as possible to really drive home your performance and hone it to a point where you're going to unleash that next level. So I hope that's answered your question, Connor. If anyone else has got any feedback or any further insights on that, I'm really keen to hear from other disciplines or different acts. I know we've got a lot of different fitness enthusiasts here that all do slightly different training, and some athletes and so on as well. So if you've got some further insights around what you reckon on this, please comment below.